Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. When it comes to widely shared anecdotes about an individual's love of history, perhaps there is no name bigger and more frequently invoked than that of Indiana Jones. While I personally never really got into the series that much, I know, sue me, I can attest to the countless discussions I've had with others about to various students, history professors, and amateur history enthusiasts alike. The romantic notion of a heroic archaeologist uncovering long-lost cities and buildings and protecting the history inside from villains who would seek to exploit them has obviously inspired thousands of careers in history and archaeology throughout the decades since its conception. However, in our current era, it can sometimes seem like the rediscovery of lost cities may itself seem like a lost relic. With how thoroughly the world has been explored, in an era of GPS and satellite technologies, it may seem like the era of monumental rediscoveries of ancient treasures is over. There are no ancient metropolis left to find, after all. If there were, wouldn't we see them on Google Earth? Except, well, that's not exactly true. In the silty estuaries and mangrove forests of the Swahili coast, there may still be lost ancient cities yet to be rediscovered after millennia of abandonment. In today's episode, let's see what we know and what remains to be known about the long-lost cities of the late antiquity Swahili coast. Season 6, Episode 3, The Lost Cities of Azania. So far, we've explored the prehistory of the Swahili coast, and the limited nature of our sources has forced us to consider the region really only in terms of abstract developments evidenced by archaeological finds and linguistics. Some animal bones here, some loan words from extinct languages there, and not much more. As a result, our only understanding of the early history of the Swahili coast comes in the form of vague timelines related to different social and economic developments. However, that changes today, as we get to dive into our first detailed written record that features the Swahili coast, albeit known by a very different name. This is one of the most useful and famous documents for studying the ancient history of not only East Africa, but also the ancient Red Sea, Arabia, India, and the history of maritime trade more generally. This is, of course, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Now, we've talked about the Periplus before on this podcast, and I even did a premium episode about it way back in the day, so if you've already listened to those episodes, this one might come across as a bit of a rehash, a more detailed and thorough rehash, but a rehash nonetheless. However, for the sake of those who haven't heard those episodes, or for those who would like a little bit of a recap, let's talk about what exactly the Periplus even is. The word Periplus has nothing to do with the similar-sounding platypus. Rather, it literally translates to Greek as sailing around. It was a type of ancient document that provides some kind of account, vaguely, of a maritime voyage. This could take the form of a very straightforward description of a single voyage, but could also refer to a kind of seafaring itinerary, a guide based on a compilation of different accounts from sailors and merchants who the author had met. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is a periplus in the latter sense, a kind of travel guide detailing the port cities that sailors would encounter on the Erythraean Sea, a Roman name which initially referred to the Red Sea but soon became synonymous with the Indian Ocean as a whole. So, if you wanted to translate the name of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea into modern parlance, I think a good translation would be something like a seafaring merchant's guide to the Indian Ocean. The Periplus is an invaluable resource for historians interested in the history of any of the regions it discusses. Originally written likely in the 1st century AD by a Greek-speaking person in Roman Egypt, it provides us a snapshot of the Indian Ocean trade network in its own time, as well as a few details about some of the most important stops that merchants would encounter along their journeys. However, as we examine the history written within the Periplus, there are going to be some limitations that need to be kept in mind. For starters, the document is written from the perspective of merchants, and therefore we need to keep in mind that the Periplus is quite biased in terms of what it highlights, focusing on things that merchants care about, like the availability of goods, ease of docking in its harbors, and how friendly their local rulers are to foreign merchants, while providing quite limited information on things like a region's domestic politics, which might concern a merchant relatively little. Additionally, and this is very important, the Periplus was not written with the intention to inform future generations at all, but for practical use in its own day. As a result, it uses a lot of vague antique location names, without any explanation, and often relies on now long gone or unknown landmarks to assist in navigation. Again, from the perspective of the time of its writing, this would have been common knowledge among sailors anyway, so didn't really need further explanation for the author. As we'll see, this is why it's not uncommon for us to be not entirely sure about the exact site of some of the locations mentioned in the Periplus. Now, in the Periplus, the author provides a handy name for a vague stretch of land across coastal East Africa, which stretches approximately across what we would nowadays call the Swahili coast. This region is referred to as the Land of Azania, a name of very, very debatable etymology. It's worth noting that in addition to referring to this region of Africa, Azania is the name of a region within southern Greece, which itself derives from the name of a semi-mythical Greek king, Azan. Given that the writer of the Periplus was a Greek speaker and likely of Greek heritage, it would seem like the simplest explanation for this etymology is that Azania in coastal Africa was named after this region of Greece. Perhaps the semi-arid oceanic climate around the Shabelle River in southern Somalia reminded Greek sailors of the semi-arid oceanic climate of southern Greece. However, this explanation is just one of many proposed ideas. Numerous linguists have proposed alternative explanations for the name Azania, ranging from different Greek origins, such as Azania meaning land without Zeus, referring to its dry climate, which wouldn't have received many thunderstorms. Other foreign origins have been proposed as well, such as the Arabic word ajam, meaning non-Arabic speaker. It could also be derived from the word Alcinite, a group of people from South Arabia who may have been active as sailors along the coast. Maybe it could come from the Persian word zang, meaning dark-skinned, although generally I've heard it proposed the other way around, that this word comes from the name Azania. Some scholars have even proposed origins as far afield as Javanese from Indonesia, from the word Jangi, meaning dark-skinned Africans. Perhaps the word Jangi reached Roman Egypt through a game of telephone and ended up, after several changes, to Azania. Additionally, others have challenged the idea that Azania is an exonym altogether, and that it may have originated within the region itself. One of the most common explanations is that it came from the word Sanka, meaning nose in Somali, referring to how that part of Africa that we call the Horn today juts out of mainland Africa like a nose sticking out from the face. It may have also derived from the Kiswahili word ziwa, which today is usually used as lake, but sometimes in older dialects of the language referred more generally to a large body of water, including the ocean. Appropriately, for a region with such an unclear etymology to its name, the Periplus provides only a few scant windows of information about the state of Azania in the 1st century. The Periplus marks the beginning of Azania, as when a sailor goes past the city of Opone, an impressive city located on the Somali coast near modern-day Hafun. Sailors would then encounter the northern beaches of Azania, a region which is largely glossed over since the Periplus identifies it as lacking any good harbors for docking and therefore not important. After about 6 days of sailing, however, the crew would encounter the region's first major port, the city of Sarapion. Judging by the estimated length of the voyage, the mainstream scholarly opinion places Sarapion somewhere in the vicinity of the city of Warsheikh or the city of Mogadishu in Somalia. Traveling south from there, sailors could encounter several other small ports and one major city, Nikon, before passing by an archipelago called the Piralea Islands, and eventually reaching the grand island of Minuthius. And oh boy, we've talked about this idea of what Minuthius even is before. Back in our season on Madagascar, I brought up that Minuthius is often identified as varyingly Zanzibar, Madagascar, Mafia Island, and occasionally as maybe one of the islands in the Seychelles or Comoros archipelagos. And, well, this is a pretty big problem, since every other place from here identified in the Periplus is only precisely located relative to its position to Minuthius. So depending on which interpretation you believe as the island of Minuthius, well, all the other sites could be in any number of places relative to that. I discuss it in more detail on our episodes on the settling of Madagascar, but in short, certain elements of the description of the island, such as it having large active rivers and large tortoises, seem to align more with the description of Madagascar. While the fairly short distance from the mainland and the fairly short distance traveled from Mogadishu seems to best align with it being Zanzibar, while the reference to passing by an archipelago beforehand and then arriving at Minuthius sometime later seems to refer to Mafia Island. Needless to say, it's complicated. One of the most interesting explanations I've heard is that since the Periplus was likely based on the collective testimonies of multiple merchants, that maybe some of the sailors had traveled to Zanzibar, others had traveled to Mafia, and others had traveled to Madagascar, and that each of them, being on a big island, just figured, oh, I'm on Minuthius, and then came back and gave a testimony to the author of the Periplus about what Minuthius is like. But while this might explain some of the difficulty in finding a concrete answer to where Minuthius is, it doesn't really help us in our case today, because Minuthius is treated like a concrete location in the Periplus. When the Periplus later tells us to head 2 days sail further south to the last major port in Azania, we can't really be sure where it's telling us to sail south from. However, if we were sailing in the days of the Periplus's writing, something tells me that this final destination would be pretty hard to miss. While the city itself is not described in much detail, the Periplus paints a grand picture of the city's mercantile role. According to the Periplus, the last major port on the coast of Azania was a city by the name of Rhapta. And yes, I looked it up, it is pronounced Rhapta. The people of this grand city of Rhapta were said to use 2 different types of ships to engage in maritime trade: smaller dugout canoes, alongside larger, more substantial vessels built by weaving planks of wood together using ropes, the same type of technique we described being used by the merchant navy of Aksum to build their ships. And it is apparently this practice of making woven boats from which the name Rhapta originates, coming from the Greek word rhaptos, meaning woven. Rhapta was described as a major trade hub, a place where merchants could buy ornate tortoise shells, as well as just one of 2 major ports for the purchase of ivory on Africa's coast. Rhapta competed with the primary Aksumite port far to their north, Adulis, to be the main exporter of ivory from East Africa, and it appears that each city adopted a different strategy to find their own market niche. While Adulis exported higher quality, hard ivory in smaller amounts, Rhapta focused on quantity to compete, taking on the role of ivory wholesaler. In addition to ivory and tortoiseshells, the region also was implied to be a major exporter of cinnamon. In fact, so great was the quantity of cinnamon leaving East African ports that Roman intellectuals and merchants alike widely assumed that East Africa had to be the original source of the spice. This spice, which was more precious than its weight in gold at times in the Mediterranean world, was not in fact from East Africa at all, but was rather grown primarily in India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia, while there is no archaeological evidence that it was ever grown in East Africa. While it's not elaborated on in the Periplus, since it's written from a Roman perspective, this little tidbit about cinnamon being grown in Rhapta might be our single best piece of evidence for the existence of a long-distance, reliable trade route between South Asia and East Africa during antiquity, and perhaps even an intentional attempt by East African merchants to embed themselves as an important middleman in the trade of precious spices between South Asia and the Mediterranean. Some scholars have even extrapolated this idea into a broader idea about the economics of the ivory trade in Adulis. While the markets of Egypt and the Mediterranean preferred so-called hard ivory, A higher quantity of Indian ivory art from the era uses soft ivory, which might indicate that in addition to being a quantity over quality approach, that the choice to export large quantities of soft ivory was also a bid by Rhapta's merchants to profit off the preferences of the Indian market. And hey, given how much cinnamon they were exporting apparently, it seems like this strategy was a winning one. However, it appears that merchants were just as likely to encounter danger as riches off the coast of this popular trade hub, as the Periplus characterizes Rhapta as additionally an early hub of piracy. In terms of the city's politics, however, the Periplus has surprisingly little to say, beyond a somewhat puzzling line that references its relationship to, of all things, the Kingdom of Himyar. Yeah, we're really going back to Season 2 today. We've mentioned Adulis and, yeah, remember Himyar? According to the Periplus, the city of Rhapta had some sort of close relationship with the Ma'afir, a tribe or clan within the Himyarite kingdom who ruled over the city of Musa. The Mafarites, as the Periplus calls them, supposedly had some sort of political power within Rhapta. To quote the Periplus, the Mafaritic chief governs Rhapta under some ancient right that subjects it to the sovereignty of the state that has become first in Arabia. And the people in Musa now hold it under its authority, and send thither many large ships using Arab captains and agents who are familiar with the natives and intermarry with them, and who know the whole coast and understand the language spoken there. There are imported into these markets the lances made at Musa especially for this trade, and hatchets and daggers and awls and various kinds of glass, and at some places a little wine and wheat, not for trade, but to serve for getting the goodwill of the barbarians. Yeah, I, and apparently many other people, don't really know what to make of this strange bit of the document. It seemingly describes the city of Rhapta as something of a colony of this tribe, the Ma'afir, but mentions that this rule comes from some ancient rite, implying that the connection between these regions goes back quite a long way even before the Periplus' writing. However, the exact extent of this relationship is never truly described. It's tempting to say that the term ancient rite is implying that the region was only governed informally based on a sort of vague historical precedent rather than a de facto government, or maybe that it was more of a tributary relationship. After all, the Mafaritic merchants had to regularly bring wine and bread to bribe the locals with, which might be further evidence of this tributary relationship. However, the fact that it's mentioned at all, as well as purportedly deep cultural and familial ties that the countries held through intermarriage, makes it tough to evaluate exactly what's going on here. Was Rhapta under formal domination by this Himyarite group, or was it simply a de jure claim to sovereignty with no real enforcement? Since the Periplus is the only document that makes any reference to such a relationship, it's hard to say. But while the Periplus' description of Rhapta ends there, it's not the only one that we have. The famous Greco-Egyptian polymath and geographer, a man by the name of Claudius Ptolemy, wrote his own geographic work which included references to Rhapta, but which veered dramatically from those laid out in the Periplus. For starters, in Ptolemy's geography, Rhapta is flanked on one side by the ocean and is directly across a thin channel from an island, and is said to also be in proximity to an enormous lake deep into the hinterland, said to be the original source of the Nile. His work also mentions regular maritime journeys from southern Arabia to Rhapta, but makes no reference at all to any conception or idea of subordination. Instead, in his description, these are just groups trading as equals. Now, Ptolemy's geographic description seemingly supports the idea that Rhapta is in Tanzania, perhaps near Zanzibar or Mafia Island, except nothing can ever be that easy. Ptolemy also states that Rhapta is 5,000 stadia, or just 788 kilometers, from Prasum, the Greek name for what we'd call today the Cape of Good Hope, the very southern fringes where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans meet. If we take this measurement literally, Rhapta would be located in southern Mozambique. This seems to align well with another little detail from the Periplus that I hadn't mentioned yet. The Periplus states that Rhapta is the last port in Azania, and that immediately after sailing on from Rhapta, you encounter where the eastern and western seas meet. On the other hand, though, these measurements are reported to Ptolemy by compiling the works of various individual sailors, and Ptolemy himself seems to be somewhat skeptical about their math. For what it's worth, Ptolemy would later make his own estimation for the latitude and longitude of the city, which, according to him, would be near modern-day Mafia Island. But the most interesting tidbit of information from Ptolemy's description of Rhapta is his easily overlooked use of the word metropolis to describe the city. It's easy to overlook because in today's parlance, calling a location a metropolis simply designates a large, economically and culturally significant city. But in the context of the classical era, the word metropolis translates more specifically to mother city, and means a city that creates and rules over smaller colonies. This term, metropolis, is the first hint we get about the political significance of Rhapta, that its mercantile importance may have also been matched by its political significance. If Rhapta was a mother city, in the parlance of his day, this would heavily imply that people from Rhapta had sailed out and created colonies of their own, other little communities within the nearby radius. This might mean that Rhapta was a capital of a centralized kingdom, or maybe it was just a powerful city-state, but one that held informal superiority over its neighbors. It's worth noting, too, that Ptolemy implies that Rhapta was, by the time of his writing, no longer the sole city of this elevated stature. Instead, there was another city, a rival for Rhapta, the city of Tonaiki. This other city, though, Tonaiki, is even less well documented than Rhapta, and only appears as this exact passing reference, and never anywhere else to my knowledge. But at least it does provide some evidence that Rhapta enjoyed a degree of political significance if it was developing rivalries like this. There is one final classical source beyond Ptolemy that might make mention of Azania, but it is an incredibly strange one. The region of Zezan is mentioned in the work The Peoples of the West, a, oh boy, Three Kingdoms era Chinese historical text, which is basically the Chinese version of the Periplus, focusing on a description of the regions beyond China, including the Roman Empire, India, and perhaps Azania in East Africa. But this is not without controversy either, as some scholars have pretty good reason to doubt that this is the region being referred to at all. To be honest, I'm inclined to agree with them. I don't think that Zezan in the Peoples of the West refers to Azania. Mostly because this would imply some incredibly basic geographic errors. For example, the book claims that Zezan was to Rome's northeast, nowhere even close to Azania. As far as I can tell, most people seem to agree with that, and instead the land of Zezan is most likely referring to a few different cities in the Black Sea region of Eastern Europe. Sadly, the records of Rhapta suddenly go dry after the 3rd century. While some Arab geographies will later make reference to the city, these works are largely just translations of Ptolemy, more interested in updating and improving his calculations of latitude and longitude than in providing updates to the status of the cities he discusses. Sadly, since the location of Rhapta is unknown, we have no body of archaeological work to draw from either. That is, unless the city was recently rediscovered. In 2016, a South African diver and Tanzanian professor of archaeology teamed up to make an exciting discovery. Near the mouth of the Rufiji River in Tanzania, that he had spotted an unusual, isolated reef in an area that usually lacked large coral clusters. But upon investigating further, it was revealed that the reef was not a reef at all, but a series of cleanly cut stone. Upon investigating further, it was found that many of these stones have been clearly quarried from the inland interior of the country. Is this finally the lost metropolis of Rhapta? Has our Azanian metropolis finally been found? Well, the site, often purported to be Rhapta, is equally controversial, fascinating, and intriguing, which is why it's going to be the topic of our newest premium episode. Is the Rufiji River site truly the remnants of one of humanity's long-lost ancient cities? We'll examine the evidence and come to a conclusion there. However, perhaps the biggest, most pressing question related to the history of Azania is who exactly its people were. Now, we know that the people who inhabited the region were dark-skinned Africans, since Ptolemy straightforwardly identified them as such. Sure, they may have intermarried with other groups like those stray Himyarites, but Africans remain the core of the region's population. But beyond their appearance, what can we say about their culture, language, or anything else? And, sorry to disappoint you, but again, the answer is very little with certainty. In fact, perhaps the biggest unanswered question is whether these cities were built before, after, or maybe during the stages of the Bantu expansion in that region. The exact timetable of the Bantu expansion is up for debate, and so whether or not the Bantu expansion had already occurred, was occurring, or had yet to even start during the writing of the Periplus and Ptolemy's geography is still unclear. This is made more difficult by the use of likely exonyms for location names, rather than local city names, which may have provided some clues. So instead, we have to devote an entirely new episode to maybe figuring out some of this mystery. Join us in our next episode as we explore the final stages of antiquity in East Africa, examine the region's archaeological culture, and perhaps identify its place in regional geopolitics in this ancient time. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate it if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayofagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, Bibi Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Mokocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwambodike, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Ghassan Firgiani, Ni T, Kitty, Matt T, Tariq Beetleman, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Switson Blair, and Yannick Bolnett, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.